Thank you very much, Noah. I'll take that cue to start. And actually, I wanted to start with a few thank yous as well to everybody who's come. It's great to see you all, and lots of friends and lots of people who've helped with this research as well in various ways. I see Lucy Munro, who encouraged us to develop this, Jane Lawson, who's helped with the research too. But I wanted to single out three people in particular for help before we get started. First is Noah, and I wanted to basically say the same thing he's just said, which is we were completing our PhDs around the same time, and I've benefited from many archival discussions with him over the years. Secondly, Rivka Zim, who I see here, lovely to see you. Rivka's kindness and scholarly generosity when I first started at King's were particularly meaningful, and I'm really glad to finally be able to accept the invitation to speak here. Thank you, Rivka. And finally, I wanted to thank Leah. I hope I'm not springing this on her too much, but it really is worth stressing that Leah's finishing her PhD at the moment, and this work isn't her PhD, it's on top of that. It grew out of conversations we had during her master's degree at King's, and continued for many years afterwards on lots of fun, quite intense walks in various parks until we realized we had an argument on our hands. So I'd been researching Bourne's biography for many years, but it was Leah's literary critical insights that really brought this paper to life. So thank you, Leah. I'm going to begin with about 10 minutes setting out some of our key themes, summarize Bourne's biography, and say a few words about the Conway Papers, the archive where her writings are mostly found. Leah will then tell you more about her writing for about 20 minutes, setting out some of the interpretive possibilities that seem to us most fruitful. And then finally, I will wrap up with another 10 minutes or so, thinking about the relationship between Bourne's texts and the archival context. And before I start sharing our PowerPoint, I should say there will be some references in this talk to domestic violence. Is that showing? Leah, could you give me a nod? Great. The letters and poems of Elizabeth Bourne tell a story of remarkable bravery and fortitude. Bourne, an Oxfordshire woman with some court connections, stood up to and escaped from her violent, cheating husband, Anthony, negotiating contemporary patronage systems to secure support. She then conducted a love affair with her appointed guardian, Sir John Conway, subsequently fighting him and his wife for custody of her daughters after the Conways made a grab for her property. Her letters, mainly preserved in British Library Additional Manuscript 23212, draw on a variety of literary genres and conventions and offer a rich source for the study of women's agency in Elizabethan England. Abused by her husband, abandoned by her family, then apparently betrayed by her lover, Bourne writes about a wide range of topics with great urgency: property, prayer, dreams, anger, fairness, justice, loneliness, vulnerability, trust, kindness, desire. Within a single letter, she might plead, cajole, demand, daydream, and rail sarcastically at her enemies. The details of what Bourne experienced can be harrowing to read. Her husband seems to have been an outright psychopath. Yet she continued to seek hope in loyalty, friendship, and love. The remarkably direct, emotional, and literary rhetoric of her self-representations and her personal record of her suffering mark her out as a unique voice from the period. I taste of fortune's bitter spite more than anybody ever did, she laments in one letter. If I should complain all my griefs to you, a whole Bible would not hold them. Bourne undoubtedly experienced appalling life events, but her tendency to portray herself as uniquely wronged lends her prose a particular urgency and vivacity. A book-length study of Elizabeth Bourne was completed in 1935 by Charles Angel Bradford, but never published, and her letters became siloed amongst the impenetrable Conway Papers. 19th century custodians labelled them as of no importance, marginalising them yet further. The ground has finally shifted in the last 2 decades. James Daybell stressed the importance of Bourne's voice in his 2006 book, Women Letter Writers in Tudor England, also identifying her as a minor poet. In 2014, I published my doctoral research on the Conway Papers, which made this notoriously messy archive at least a little bit easier to navigate. And most recently, in 2021, Cristina, Léon, Alfar, and Emily Sherwood made these texts significantly more accessible by publishing a selected edition of Bourne's correspondence, simultaneously untangling the legal controversies around her marriage. This archival material poses a particular set of research quandaries. Elizabeth Bourne's writings promise thrilling new insights into the inner world of an Elizabethan woman. Yet the documents that tell us about her life are dominated by exploitative relationships with two men who threaten to take over the story. At the same time, the striking directness of Bourne's voice can lead to a sense of familiarity that could potentially skew a reader's interpretation. It would be a shame if Bourne, evidently a complex and clever individual, became characterized only by the alluringly immediate emotions that make her writing so clear, so compelling. Leah and I are fortunate to be working at a time when, and with colleagues for whom, the case for reading early modern women's writing no longer needs to be laboured. For example, in my own department at King's, Lizzie Scott Bowman will soon be following her volume of Women Poets of the English Civil War, co-edited with Sarah Ross, with an Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Women's Writing in English, co-edited by Lizzie, Sarah and Danielle Clark. That said, when we did our literature review for this paper, articles and chapters published as recently as 2021 stress the difficulty of convincing publishers, students and many male scholars to take women's writing as seriously as the early modern male canon. Laura Dodds and Michelle M. Dowd suggested only in 2020 that the field of early modern women's writing operates as a kind of alternate reality to the wider field of Renaissance literary studies. In the words of Jamie Goodrich and Paula McQuaid, the field tends to measure the works of women writers by the Procrustean bed of aesthetic and formal standards established by canonical male authors, and then to marginalize those texts when they do not fit these predetermined criteria. Goodrich and McQuaid go on to make the case against the mere recovery of lost voices as a context-free good in itself. They point out that we should not be pitting ourselves as feminist saviors while ignoring reasons for the exclusion of women writers from the canon, aside from or additional to patriarchal oppression, such as aesthetic categories, shifting models of historiography, and evolving understandings of generic value. Today, we want to think about Bourne from two perspectives. Leah will draw attention to some of the fascinating generic maneuvers Bourne makes in her writing, and I will end by thinking about the role of the archive itself in the preservation of the material. These are documents that tell a story of domestic violence, yet the archive itself must be understood as the site of violence for this material to be fully understood. Elizabeth, née Horne, H-O-R-N-E, was born in 1549 in Sarsden, Oxfordshire, where a memorial to her still survives. She married Anthony Bourne in September 1565, the son of Sir John Bourne, Queen Mary's principal Secretary of State, although Anthony squandered most of the Bourne estate, ruining the family's fortunes. Anthony was a pathological cheat, liar, and philanderer, extremely prone to physical violence and able to raise armed gangs to intimidate his enemies. While I talk about this unpleasant character, here is a slide of the Horne, Bourne, and Conway family trees. Anthony's crimes against Elizabeth were vicious and unrelenting. Having sworn her death and destruction, he repeatedly beat and threatened her, tried to poison her, and threatened to blow up the house with gunpowder with his wife and children inside. On one occasion, with his dagger drawn, he swore that before one of his mistresses, Ursula Pagnam, should lack, he would tear his wife's skin off her back. Chillingly, he hired a man from France with a burned hand to follow Elizabeth's movements and to bribe her servants for information, probably with the intention of murdering her, at least, I think, to give her that idea. Meanwhile, Anthony defrauded his wife of thousands of pounds, spending the money on his affairs. Having racked up enormous debts, Anthony Bourne was sent to the Tower in 1578. His assets, such as he had, were placed in a trust, and Sir John Conway, a former soldier who had distinguished himself in the Low Countries, serving alongside the Sydneys, was appointed sole trustee, becoming guardian of the Bourne's two daughters, Mary and Amy, and Amy would go on to marry Sir John's son, Fulk. The marriage arrangements caused Elizabeth great consternation, especially in the ways they appropriated Bourne property into Conway hands. At a certain point, rumour had begun to circulate about the nature of the relationship between Elizabeth and John. She herself admitted that everybody had no other word in their mouth, but that my maid could tell such tales of you and me as shall make us blush. Lady Conway understandably became very desirous to know the letters that passed between you and me. Like Alfar and Sherwood, we agree that Elizabeth and John had a romantic and probably sexual affair. They exchanged books, probably romances, and seem to have sent each other poetry. Bourne's letters to Conway are strikingly and unguardedly passionate about physical and emotional love, a rare quality in surviving women's letters from the period. I rejoice in you more than I am able to express. O happy thing of this life, O joy of our age, what creature can be more happier than I, who loves and is loved, interchangeable, unrevocable? Bourne's letters frequently lament the fact that her friends and family have abandoned her. Seeking reliable allies, she often refers to what she deserves from relationships and thinks she has found in Conway. Faced with relentless abuse, her imagery tends to evoke places of solace and sanctuary. Little is known about Bourne's later life. She died on August 25th, 1599 in Churchill, Oxfordshire. Churchill and Sarsden are basically the same town, they're very close to each other. Much of her surviving writing inevitably concerns the failure of her marriage, testifying to her protracted first-hand experience of the legal system. Yet her surviving texts also call for literary reading strategies. In a voice characterized by a powerful candidness, Bourne nevertheless adopts and adapts a range of styles, registers, and personae. Her correspondence, which is frustratingly undated, includes official and informal petitions, complaint, biblical allusion, dream vision, embedded fragments of verse, and nods to the Romance tradition. Much of her writing has a clandestine aspect, and at points, Bourne uses cryptic rhyming anti-signatures to simultaneously disguise and identify herself. Elsewhere, she describes her writings as secret ciphers, drawing on the language of intelligence, and draws enigmatic symbols on the outside of her letter packets. She even secured some letters with tamper-evident letter-locking techniques, more usually the preserve of professional secretaries. I'll now hand over to Leah, who's going to use a selection of Bourne's letters to go into more detail about their linguistic and generic features.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Noah and the Tudor Stuart Seminar for having us. And I'd also like to thank Daniel for the opportunity to work on this incredible writer, and also for introducing me to the excitement of collaborative research, which is very new for me. This evening, I'll discuss 3 examples of Elizabeth Bourne's writing, which represent different shades on the spectrum of her correspondence. Each letter is written to the same recipient, John Conway. One is a highly strategic petition, which is embroiled in courtly negotiation. The 2 other examples are love letters, in one of which is embedded an astonishing dream vision. The full force of Bourne's rhetorical erudition is keenly felt in her petitionary writing, which included both familiar letters of request and formal legal petitions. Petition was a central tool for Bourne in her legal battle for divorce and was a genre with which she is particularly associated. As Sherwood and Alfar have noted, Bourne had to use her considerable rhetorical and legal strategies against a biased divorce system in her petition to the Privy Council in 1582. Simultaneously, Bourne made careful use of her network, appealing to Conway for assistance with the composition of her formal letters and seeking legal advice from everyone's favourite named early modern lawyer, Sir Julius Caesar. In a courtly chain of connections, she also asked her friend Lady Elizabeth Morgan to intercede for her by, in turn, persuading Blanche Parry, the Queen's gentlewoman, to most earnestly move Her Majesty for me in a reasonable suit. Bourne's mother, Lady Mervyn, who was also one of Elizabeth the First Lady in Waiting, separately petitioned Sir Francis Walsingham, urging his consideration of Bourne's case. Bourne's archive offers rich insights into the collaboration and networking that supported petitionary writing behind the scenes. In her petitionary writing, Bourne makes strategically gendered appeals for protection, which interweave direct requests, rhetorically performative helplessness, and subtly persuasive scriptural allusion. Spending some time with one of Bourne's letters to Conway showcases her petitionary strategies in action. In the letter, Bourne seeks assistance with her ongoing legal battle. A respectful formal reference to his wife suggests it was composed before their affair ensued. Opening without a formal address, not even a cursory sir, Bourne immediately establishes an urgent tone fraught with tragic hope. I cannot but take it very thankfully your comfortable lines. It is a thing which in grief gives the best comfort. Conway is crucially cast as the source of hope, putting pressure on him to deliver. Barely touching on cursory pleasantries or such familiar formula as humbly beseeching, she launches directly into her appeal. I persuade myself and live in hope to be released out of this bondage, but you must be the mean thereto, or else I shall have small help, for of myself I can do nothing. You put me in comfort you have devised a way to end this troublesome life I lead, and to bring me some quiet in the end of my days, which I fear will not be many if I continue a prisoner. My hope is in you, and I refer all to you. My grief is such as I cannot help myself. You see, all my kin have forsaken me. Therefore, if you ever said you would friend me, now is the time to show it. Bourne emphasizes her isolation and betrayal. All mine own kin have forsaken me. She emphatically declares her powerlessness at several points in this short passage. For of myself, I can do nothing. I cannot help myself. She seemingly submits entirely to Conway's counsel. I refer all to you. Her seeming lack of agency is underpinned by a soft scriptural allusion. The reflexive phrase, for of myself I can do nothing, closely resembles Christ's assertion of God's authority. I can do nothing of mine own self. I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father who hath sent me, from John 5:30. Bourne thus emphasizes that Conway is the prime mover in her affairs. Bourne draws more openly upon biblical, classical, and legal reference in her petition to the Privy Council, both for exemplary evidence of the punishment of adultery and for rhetorical effect, likening Mistress Pagnam, with whom her husband had a protracted affair, to the Gorgon. Yet behind Bourne's staged helplessness lie forceful imperatives. You must be the means. Now is the time to show it. Bourne contrasts her ambiguously hoped for and passively constructed liberation, I live in hope to be released out of this bondage, with the sudden, monosyllabic, uncompromising identification of Conway as her saviour, but you must be the means. Generically, she petitions, rhetorically, she commands. Written about her petition to the Privy Council, Alfar and Sherwood similarly identify Bourne's alternating vulnerability and entitlement. Her closing statements make strong assertions with carefully gendered qualifications. There is no sound reason in my judgment, under the correction of my betters, that may lead me to consent to dwell with Master Bourne. In this letter to Conway, Bourne puts the closing formulaic prayer for a petition's recipient to additional persuasive use at the letter's end. I leave myself to your help, praying the Almighty ever to requite that which I am not able, and ever to guide and prosper you to your end. And this, with my friendly commendations to your good lady and yourself, I end. Bourne tactically shifts from passively abandoning herself to Conway's help, to her prayers for God to morally guide Conway, pretty clearly directing him to help her out of Christian duty. Likewise, it is conventional to commend an addressee spouse at the end of her letter. However, it is also possible that with this final courtesy, Bourne sets her own torturous isolation in contrast with Conway's marriage. Bourne's petition demonstrates that despite her isolation, she was armed with a crucial weapon, her adept ability to persuade. At the opposite end of the spectrum, two of Bourne's love letters to Conway illustrate the passion, imagination, and lyricism of her writing. Bourne and Conway wrote strikingly candid, moving love letters. In the first of the two love letters, Bourne exploits the erotic potential of early modern epistolary convention. As Gary Schneider has usefully argued, epistolary contact in early modern England manifested its effective power not by being actual face-to-face contact, but by inscribing rhetorical strategies based on speech, orality, and bodily presence. Bourne and Conway drew on similar language and imagery throughout their surviving letters to one another, envisaging an erotic space in which their material engagements replicate the real physical contact denied them. Conway describes Bourne's missives as embodiments of their sender. For your letter is the image of yourself, and this is most true, that in the letter of a very friend, the heart is delighted, the eyes pleased, the understanding comforted, and all the spirits rejoiced. Bourne elaborates on the proximity and interaction enabled by letters, playing with the erotic potential of inscribed bodily presence. I hope that mine own night will bring it so to pass that we at an instant receive the full of our delights to both our comforts without any respective persons. This I believe, in this I joy, in this I live. And hope, and if my bad scribbling shall ever give you cause to send me the choice of my delights, next to your own presence is the sight of your letters most welcome. Therefore I will never cease to please you and delight you with my plain true letters, which never say half so much as my hand thinketh. I love you. I will never cease to say that so long as my hand can write it and my tongue can tell it, and you do like I should say so. Following the precepts of early modern epistolary theory, she imagines the letter as the image of her absent correspondent. Next to your own presence is the sight of your letters most welcome. The repeated emphasis upon her hand and tongues further eroticizes the letter as an embodiment of its sender. Whilst her letters cannot say half so much as my hand thinketh, her developing use of delight is illuminating. Delight begins as the imagined satisfaction of a future liaison. We at instant receive the full of our delights. She then begins to meld sexual and epistolary contact as delight becomes the presence of Conway, either in person or on paper. Send me the choice of my delights. Next to your own presence is the sight of your letters most welcome. Subsequently, seeking to delight you with my plain true letters, Bourne transforms physical contact with her letter into contact with her body. I will never cease to say that as long as my hand can write it and my tongue can tell it, and you do like I should say so. The curious sentience of my hand thinketh further entwines the intellectual and sexual. Her thinking hand makes sexual contact an expression of the mind, while blending the script on the page with her own touching hands. Bourne exploits early modern epistolary convention, making her letters a space for the uniquely candid, sophisticatedly constructed expression of her desire, which transcends the restrictions of reality. Their correspondence does not, however, represent a safe space. They are rife with imminent threat. Bourne feared and appeared to be subject to surveillance at various points in her life. Slide. Thank you. Arranging a clandestine meeting with Conway, Bourne advises, if you come at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I can let you in, and nobody shall know it, for they all shall be fast asleep, as I had much ado to wake them. If you come on Friday, you may be sure there is none at home. This invitation is quickly qualified by the expression instruction, you must not come this week, which runs sideways up the margin, materially echoing the confines of their relationship. Slide. Lena Cohen-Orlin describes how many extramarital liaisons were conducted in the house's most liminal spaces, or indeed outside of it. In fact, Conway and Bourne began to conduct their affair even farther afield, in the realm of the imagination. In one letter, Conway recalls having read aloud to Bourne from a Latin history, which he offered to translate in full, which we take to be Conway's own disguised creation. In the middle of a letter, he takes his reader into a magical clearing in the woods, where he has been led by a colourful female bird to a plenteous table of food and drink. His yearning for his lover in the clearing conjures her imagined presence, and together they eat. The letter ends with an invitation to Bourne, both to co-create, tell me who she was, where she is, and how she doth, and to cohabit this shared world. If you will send me word when and whither I shall travel out again to see her, I will devise a means to bring myself to her presence. Let me receive your answer to this. Bourne accepted the invitation to create a shared fantasy with a generically appropriate dream vision sequel. I'll take a moment here to read a longer excerpt from this compelling letter. Slide. I chanced of late to sit alone in my muse, and musing fell into a sleep. And dreaming, methought there came a man unto me, which said unto me, that man you wot of hath sent for you, and would have you come to such a place by 1 of the clock, and said to me, you must make no delay. Methought, waking out of my dream, I had rather have been present straightway than absent. But nevertheless, I remembering the absence of us two is as presence. But rising out of my muse, I thought to travel to the place, and going over the fields at length, I came to a house, where I saw nobody, nor I thought nobody did in abide there. At last I saw a man, which bade me go into the house and sit down and rest myself, over-wearied with travel, and being very thirsty and dry. At last he gave me a glass of wine. I drank, and then he gave me fruits to eat. Slide. And then he, leaving me there alone, went to fetch us some meat, and bade if anyone did knock, I should hearken what they were and let them in. At last I heard one knock, and hearing not his voice, I knew not what he was. But he, seeming something bold, he opened the one door, and came to the other, and knocked, and said, who dwells here? Nobody. Then I, hearing his voice, knew who he was, and opened the door. And he saying these words, though my fate have forced to carry my body from this place, that my heart will not suffer me to turn my head from you, which is the cause that have made me this boldly to intrude myself to your company. This, talking and dreaming away the time, sat down to eat of that was there, and to drink of the wine. Isolation and solitude are an immediate feature of her dream vision. She begins sat alone, and we are twice reminded that the house is unoccupied. In the dialogue with the male entrant, who we take to represent Conway, it seems the answer to who dwells here is nobody. The quasi-servant figure also withdraws from the scene. He leaves her there alone. Like Conway's promise to travel out again to their dream world, Bourne's dream involves a long physical journey to a tryst with a set time and location. Rising out of my muse, I thought to travel to the place, and going over the fields at length. Once again, the lovers share an imagined private space denied to them in reality. Bourne's opening meditation on the relationship between absence and presence is powerfully representative of their literary exchange. The absence of us two is as presence. Although Bourne smoothly follows Conway's generic choice, the house in her dream vision and the activities conducted within it are poignantly quotidian. Houses, or estates, were the continued site of legal and personal conflict for Bourne. Anthony and Elizabeth did not cohabit during the early years of their marriage, and when they did, it was deeply traumatic. Anthony slept with Bourne's own maid, whom she dismissed, only to have him install a sex worker as her new maid. Anthony sold Bourne's own land to finance an affair, and his flight to Calais without the Queen's permission almost saw the entire estate confiscated as a penalty. Slide. In a letter to her half-sister Lucy in 1584, Bourne expresses the distress of her peripatetic life. When I was constrained by necessity to seek the aid of friends, to resist the injuries my unkind husband offered me himself and my children, to the utter overthrow of us all, I first sought my refuge amongst those by which nature were most bound to have yielded me assistance. Being refused, I was forced to accept aid amongst strangers. I live at Salisbury, where I mean to secrete myself and my sorrows until God give me a better estate. Her weariness of the humiliating search for refuge is palpable. In their dream visions, the house offers refuge for Conway and Bourne, respectively overwearied with travel and worried with travel, a common symbol for hardship in the allegory of life. Slide. Bourne often writes to Conway of him securing her peace, as we have seen in a more tactical form in the petition. You put me in comfort, you have devised a way to end this troublesome life I lead and bring me to some quiet in the end of my days. Elsewhere, she expresses a feeling of security with Conway. I must be with them as I must be safest and most to my liking, which will be where I am nearest you. For Gaston Bachelard, dreaming of houses is inextricably tied both to shelter and the security of the past. We see that the imagination builds walls of impalpable shadow, comforts itself with the illusion of protection. Bourne's vision of the lovers talking and dreaming away the time in an empty room is an illusion of protection. the wish for quietness and safety granted. Slide. Furthermore, the man knocking to be let in, recalls Matthew 7:7, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. The passage is also reminiscent of Revelation 3:20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come in unto him and will sup with him and he with me. The dream feast of wine and meat also echoes the communion. Their dreamed private space is simultaneously quotidian and a fantasy of a promised heaven. For Bachelard, through dreams, the various dwelling places in our lives co-penetrate and retain the treasures of former days. Notably, Bourne's dream house is all the more poignant because her domestic past was so troubled. For Bachelard, the dreamed house is imbued with longing for what was. For Bourne, it seems to express a longing for a safe marital cohabitation that never was. Bourne offers us a variety of alternating epistolary voices. In one letter, we can shift from intense vulnerability to blazing forthright assertion. We might be drawn to Bourne both as a rhetorical and legal strategist and as a human being responding with candid emotion to her personal misfortune. These interests are not mutually exclusive. Bourne's compositive voices presents in the extreme the challenge and excitement of working on early modern epistolary writers. Personal letters can be socially strategic and staged. Dazzling moments of human insight can also be glimpsed in the most highly formal and formulaic letters. Elizabeth Bourne not only survived using her literary abilities, but took pride in them. Slide. In a scathing letter to Lady Conway, Bourne derides Lady Conway's late learned eloquence with a metaphor of the schoolroom. You must set apart more of your idle exercises by larger time and more industry of your schoolmasters to become a deeper student in rhetoric than you are. Bourne's parodic school report swaggeringly implies her own rhetorical expertise. In the ethical quandaries which her work raises, perhaps one of the greatest respects we can pay Bourne is to read her as a deep student in rhetoric. I will now pass back to Daniel to reflect on the ethics of Bourne and her archival afterlife.
Thank you, Leah. Most of Bourne's letters can be found in the British Library, making access to them relatively straightforward today. Yet her corpus is required, especially patient paleographical transcription, since both she and Conway have difficult hands. Further, identification of her authorship is partial and often provisional. Much of this material plays with anonymity and isolation, and draws attention to its own radically insecure context of composition. Messy, undated, incohesively ordered, and sometimes fragmentary, these texts pose particularly difficult interpretive challenge, which we want to suggest often verge on moral quandaries. Much recent pioneering work on early modern women's writing is in dialogue with a half-century of scholarship on manuscript culture. With the so-called archival turn has come an increasingly sophisticated awareness that archives are not neutral and passive vehicles of authoritative or true facts, but instead constitute active sites of meaning production, which intervene in the construction of individual and cultural identity, and which actively define, control, and legitimize knowledge. One of the best books on this subject in recent years is Archives and Information in the Early Modern World. I love this book, an essay collection edited by Elizabeth Bourne, Kate Peters, and Alexandra Walsham. As the editors explain, the late 18th and 19th centuries were the crucible in which the principle of historical empiricism and the idea of archival neutrality were forged. In this era, many of Europe's national archives are formally established. In France, the Archives Nationales in the aftermath of the Revolution of 1789. In the Netherlands, the Algemeen Rijksarchief in 1795. In Britain, the Public Record Office in 1838. And in Spain, the Archivo Histórico Nacional in 1866. Each institution's finding aids and calendars contribute to a particular version of the history of the state and a coherent collective past. King students will recognise this building, the former site of the Public Record Office before it moved to Kew and became the National Archives. is now the main King's Library, the Morn, but as the PRO was once known as the Strongbox of Empire. As the editors of Archives and Information astutely put it, while past generations of historians and record keepers must not be made a foil for our own self-congratulatory myths of historiographical superiority, it is nevertheless true that the rhetorical positions they adopted have served to effect their own decisive role in the invention of historical tradition. It's with these cautions in mind that I want to sketch a brief history of the Conway Papers, especially its 18th and 19th century moments of recovery and formal adoption into the national story. The Conway Papers were amassed over many decades by several generations of the Conway family, roughly speaking, from the beginning of Elizabeth I's reign to the end of the Restoration. The son of Sir John Conway was Edward, 1st Viscount Conway, Secretary of State to James I and Charles I, and a collector of Donne and Johnson in manuscript. His son Edward, 2nd Viscount, was one of the greatest private book collectors of the 17th century, with a combined library of something like 13,000 volumes. His son in turn, another Edward, Earl of Conway, was also Secretary of State to Charles II. Their personal papers and state papers both proliferated and combined before the family's influence declined and the whole mass was left to rot in a back room at Ragley Hall in Warwickshire, nibbled by rats and used to light fires. It was Horace Walpole who dragged them out of the dust in the 1750s. Walpole claims he retrieved a single chest of papers from a collection that once occupied several whole rooms. Vast numbers have been destroyed, he explained, yet I came time enough to retrieve vast numbers, many indeed in a deplorable condition. Eventually, overwhelmed by his many projects, Walpole seems to have put the Conway Papers aside, as he complained to a friend, "Pray, what horse race do you go to next? For my part, I can't afford to lead such a life. I have Conway Papers to sort, I have Lives of the Painters to write, I have my prints to paste, my house to build, and everything in the world to tell posterity. How am I to find time for all this?" Saved from the hearths of Ragley, the Conway Papers nevertheless risked disappearance once more. Ominous dark background here. It would be more than half a century before John Wilson Croker, writer, editor, MP, and I hope to convince you, part-time vampire, was commissioned by the 3rd Marquess of Hertford to have another go at sorting out the Conway Papers. Croker has not impressed most of his biographers. He has been called the wickedest of reviewers, whose writings caused the suicide of actor John Edwin and perhaps hastened the death of Keats, so they say. A man with a malignant ulcer in his mind who employed his faculties for the gratification of his own morbid inclination to give pain. A bad, not only that, but a very bad man, a scandal to politics and to letters. Croker's enemy, Lord Macaulay, claimed he was a man who would go 100 miles through the snow and sleet on top of a coach to search a parish register and prove a man illegitimate or a woman older than she says she is. Let's face it, Croker is not exactly the knight in shining armour we want to see swoop to the rescue, but it was he that saved the Conway Papers. Realising that Croker would make the most of them, Lord Hertford gave the Conway Papers to him as a gift in 1824, and this will show you how much he cared about them. He said, "My dear Croker, you will do me a favour to take them away to your own house and tear them up for," I'm told the phrase is bum fodder. Like Walpole, Croker's attention focused on letters of state, and he planned to print the archive in 5 volumes. But in the late 1820s, he received a life-changing commission to edit Boswell's Life of Johnson and gave up on the project. As Isaac Disraeli noted at the time, what an odd fate these collections have met with. They were made with great care by very careless persons, since better means were not taken to preserve them. And now, having in part escaped the fury of cooks, the critical nibblings of mice and the mould of time, they have found, as it was presumed, an editor so skillful and spirited as yourself, a publisher so active as John Murray, and a possessor so liberal as Lord Hertford, all to no purpose. With such unexpected good fortune, the Conway Papers will probably never be seen by the world, and, what is more important, never be consulted by the historian. Fortunately, at Croker's death in 1857, the papers were bequeathed to the nation. Political documents were removed to the Public Record Office, now the National Archives, and the leftovers were given to the British Museum and now form part of the British Library collection. In January 1860, Sir Frederick Madden, keeper of the manuscripts, noted that the papers received by the museum consisted of 13 packets of family letters, papers on private and uninteresting matters, and some miscellaneous tracts and fragments of no value at all. I think that the trustees have been treated shamefully in the matter, he added. Still, the Conway Papers had at last found a stable home and were available, albeit in a rather tattered and leftover state, for historical research. Yes and no, there is an all-important coda to this story for our purposes. On the 27th of June 1860, the poet Thomas Gray wrote to William Mason at the British Museum. Gray had been asked to transcribe a batch of Conway Papers and had returned them. Mason had asked what he should do with the pile he had received from Gray, who replied, as I remember, they were divided into 3 parcels, on the least of which I had written the word nothing or of no consequence. It did not consist of above 20 letters at most, and if you find anything about Mr. Bourne's affair, it is certainly so. If this is the case, they may as well be burnt. But if there is a good number and about affairs of state, which you may smell out, then it is one of the other parcels, and I am distressed and must find some method of getting it up again. I think I had described the 2 packets that signified anything, one, papers of Queen Elizabeth or earlier, the other, papers of King James and Charles I. Pray heaven it is neither of these. Reading Bourne's letters today, it seems remarkable that these original, beguiling and informative documents could ever be deemed of no importance. Yet, of course, Mason and his contemporaries were still sifting Conway family material for state papers. Elizabeth's letters do not even make it into Gray's summary of the manuscript's contents, which he defines as Mr. Bourne's affairs. A clear hierarchy is established between the affairs of state, whose loss merits distress, and the unnamed woman's letters of no importance, which are worthy of a second death in the fire. Countless women's texts must have met similar fates, permanently erased from the ostensibly neutral archive. These letters were composed and saved in unambiguously patriarchal circumstances. They describe a woman's relationships with her husband and another married man, negotiated through male courts and patronage networks. Retained in the archive of the married man who had an affair with Bourne and who benefited financially from marrying his son to her daughter, they only survived because of the efforts of the misanthropic and probably misogynistic Croker, and because their male 19th century custodians deigned not to throw them away. Their status as archived text does not just secure their survival, it conditions and should condition our reading experience. While preparing this research, Leah and I have frequently asked ourselves to what extent the modern reader, especially a male one like myself, imposing a conjectured order onto these materials and prying into Bourne's emotional and erotic privacy, continues to invade her space. The abuse started by her husband and continued in the archival history seems potentially perpetuated in the scholarly process. We found ourselves torn between the desire to protect Bourne's privacy and the knowledge that every new female voice from early modern England enriches our understanding of women's imaginative lives in the period, and found ourselves faced with the opportunity to challenge ostensibly legitimate meaning imposed on the documents by their earlier archivists. We're conscious that, as Bourdieu and Passeron have argued, every power which manages to impose meanings and to impose them as legitimate by concealing the power relationships which are the basis of its force, contributes its own specifically symbolic force to those power relationships. Marked as letters of no importance, they symbolically carry no importance. Recovered and presented as important, they are empowered against that symbolic violence. Few spaces for Bourne were truly safe, including the archive. Oppressed physically, socially, and legally, Elizabeth Bourne was able to create some kind of escape and find solace in a romantic literary exchange which harnessed the power of language to temporarily transcend her situation. Bourne was not a major figure in Elizabethan England, yet her story conspicuously illustrates the role of the imaginative interior world in female agency. Her story also dramatically demonstrates the major shift in historiographical assumptions that has taken root only in the last 50 years or so. The provenance of her papers prompts us to consider whether Bourne's letters are as exceptional as they seem. How common was it for a woman to think like Bourne and leave traces of those thoughts? Bourne's letters offer historians vital evidence of women's engagement with legal and patronage systems in this period, making them essential sources for studies of late Tudor England. Yet they also record a compelling and rare account of sexuality and emotion that brings the period alive to students especially. And Leah and I have both used these letters to teach, and they really make great material. This personal interest comes with its own ethical challenges. We must balance the recognition of Bourne's unique confessional voice without overemphasizing it, which would risk reducing the story to something purely effective, or worse, a sexed up story from the archives. We must also reconcile our duty to tell Bourne's story accurately with a corrective historiographical impulse to refuse to allow Anthony Bourne and John Conway's voices to dominate. Finally, the very survival of Bourne's letters draws out the archival context of her writing, helping make clear just how much analogous writing from contemporary women must have been lost over the years. The politics of their survival helps us understand how women's voices come to us mediated through and distorted by archival systems freighted with historical ideologies and prejudices. If Bourne herself found only partial redress against early modern misogyny, the survival of her papers may at least offer historians and literary scholars an opportunity to overturn some of those gender and power prejudices of the past.